Welcome to my presentation, Disclosing History, Adventures with Old Photographs. My name is James Kostuchk, and I live on Crescent Lake in beautiful Portage la Prairie. To be honest, I live on a marsh, but the locals prefer to call it a lake, so it is a lake. Many of you might picture this when you think of a teacher, but that isn't me. I have an interesting and fulfilling job. I work with grade 12 students who have not been attending school. We use the entire community as our classroom. Here we are at the Portage Spillway, completing a biology lesson. Here our students are practicing committee work with the mayor of Portage la Prairie. Here we are at Dakota Teepee First Nation, learning about the lives of Indigenous people before the arrival of Europeans. Our approach has improved student attendance by 38%, but it can be tiring. On our first day of class, students walked 20,000 steps. This is one of my favorite photographs. We wanted students to experience what it was like to be a soldier in World War I. So for lunch, we fed them bully beef, hardtack biscuits, and no alcohol beer. They didn't enjoy it very much, but they had a lot to write about when we got back to the classroom. I could talk about my students all day, but you are here to learn about my book of Portage la Prairie photographs. It is available at McNally Robinson. Speaking of historic photographs, this image shows my book outselling More Abandoned Manitoba. Of course, it was only for a week when all my friends and family members bought a copy, but I'm still calling it a win. I used the word disclosing as a title for my slideshow. Disclosing means to uncover. I have uncovered a lot of history with this book. I'm starting to get a good feel for the changes this community has experienced since 1870. My book is subtitled From Saskatchewan Trail to Royal Road for a reason. The Saskatchewan Trail is captured here with an ox train heading west in 1880. Here is the same spot 140 years later. Something that is perhaps underappreciated with historic photographs is the detective work required to place them in space and time. Often you start with a blank slate. You guess at the details. Sometimes you make a lucky discovery. When my mom was in the hospital, her roommate wanted to see some of my images for this book. She recognized the subject of this photo right away. John McLean II and his horse and carriage were on this spot in 1897. I had no idea where this house was or who owned it until one of the members of our Heritage Committee remembered the diamond-shaped window. Here is the same house 120 years later. In 1929, the city built a new bridge to Island Park. My friend Les Green, our city's most noted historian, has watched the construction both as a baby and as a retiree. Here is a view of the construction in 1929. Here is the view from Les Green's scooter taken in 2021. Here we see King George VI and the Queen Mother arriving in Portage la Prairie by train in 1939. They attended a service at Trinity United Church. This is the same spot over 80 years later. This is Lyle's Tailor Shop, 1897. This is the same building today. It pays to look closely at old photographs. In the Lyle Tailor Shop photo, you can clearly see Fairburns, a store, across the street from the reflection in the window. City Hall was constructed between 1896 and 1898. The building originally served as post office, customs house, and inland revenue office. The designer was Thomas Fuller, who also designed the Langevin Block and the Parliamentary Library in Ottawa. Today, the building serves as City Hall. Completing this project allowed me to see my community in many new and interesting ways. This is the Albion Hotel in 1893. Take a close look at the door on the left. Here is the same building, taken in 1950. Do you see the difference? Someone raised the building and put in a basement. This photo of the interior of the Albion Hotel might show a breakfast service. If you look closely, you can see some pancakes and toast on the table. Another great Portage historian, Brian Barrett, pointed out an interesting feature in this photograph. The bricks on the ground were needed to clad these old wood frame buildings, owing to new fire codes. As I went through hundreds of photos to make this book, I think I was sometimes guilty of overthinking things. This image originally appeared in Anne Collier's 1970 History of Portage la Prairie. At that time, it wasn't known where or why it was taken. I spent a lot of time looking at this photo, at the buildings, at the awnings, trying to figure out when it might have been taken and what might be going on. But I missed an important clue. Once I realized that there were elephants walking down Saskatchewan Avenue, it was pretty easy to connect this to the circus that came to town in 1905. I'm also a little embarrassed to admit that for the longest time, I thought I was dealing with a live elephant in this photograph of the Portage Carnival Company. As it turns out, the elephant is actually some children in a costume. I believe I know why a historian like Jack Bumstead could run a mystery bookshop. People who develop a curiosity about the world are more likely to enjoy detective work. And that is really what history is all about. It can lead you down a rabbit hole, however. This one is courtesy of Gord Goldsboro. This superb photograph is by Edwin Clay Blair, a photographer who operated in the Portage la Prairie area at the turn of the 20th century. Blair worked across Western Canada. Here we see the large railway yards at Portage la Prairie in 1905. Here we see construction of the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway bridge crossing the Assiniboine River near Portage la Prairie. The railway station. Land seekers preparing to board the train at Portage la Prairie. Here's an interior image of the dining room for 350 workers staying in Portage la Prairie during the building of the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway. Thanks to Gord Goldsborough, I was made aware that Edwin had a brother, Thomas Henry Blair. Thomas Henry Blair was a well-known inventor and photographer. In fact, Blair was so successful that he operated stores in Boston, New York, Chicago, and London. His brother, Edwin, actually managed the stores in Boston and New York for a period of time. Blair was bought out by Kodak in 1900. The sale made him a small fortune, and he was able to retire. The question I had is, why would Blair's brother end up on the Canadian prairies working as an itinerant photographer? It turns out that Edwin C. Blair had a penchant for pornographic photography. Newspapers across the prairies carried stories of his various arrests. At his trial in Portage la Prairie for sending indecent photos in the mail, Edwin Blair stated that he would rather spend the rest of his life in an asylum than be tempted by the modern woman. Edwin Clay Blair ended his days at an asylum in British Columbia. I think the most exciting thing about old photographs is that people love them. This is the Facebook page of Portage la Prairie Memories. In less than a year, it has over 6,000 members sharing photos and stories. And I'm proud to reveal that the most used images in the group are from the Manitoba Historical Society's MB 1870 photograph collection, followed by people sharing images from my book. The power of Facebook sharing is remarkable. One Facebook user, completely unknown to our local Heritage Committee, as he doesn't reside in our community, has provided me with 35 pages of corrections and elaborations to my book, comprising over 150 pieces of information. To illustrate the interest in history that the book has generated, I offer one example. This photograph from page 23 in my book shows the east end of Portage la Prairie in 1884, prior to the arson fires that destroyed much of the business district. In the book, I note that you can see the Merchants Hotel, the Fire Bell Tower, and the Pratt Opera House. Between January 1887 and May 1888, serial arsonist Sam Mick destroyed much of our city's downtown area. Here, a Facebook user has mapped the progress of one of Sam Mick's fires on the evening of May 20th, 1888. The fire progressed northward from the mill at number 1 to the arena at number 10. In closing, I want to make a case for preserving the visual history of Manitoba. As exciting as it is that the Hudson's Bay Company building on Portage Avenue is going to receive $25 million in provincial funding, I cannot help but reflect on my own heritage budget, which is about $1,000 a year. In this community alone, we have over 50,000 photo negatives sitting at the high school and thousands of hours of video in the closets of 2 former employees of our former TV station, MTN. This is the interior of Portage la Prairie's Ukrainian Catholic Church. The building is long gone, but the interior was said to be one of the finest in the West. This image is erasing itself, and without proper conservation will be lost forever. Isn't this just as important and significant as bricks and mortar? I will now open the presentation up to any questions.